You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Podcast where you get a masterclass in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, I am answering a question from Holly in Virginia, and she wrote in about a 5-year-old child and a specific session that she had with this little boy. So I'm going to read parts of her question and then share some thoughts, and we'll kind of process the whole scenario. It's specifically about a child who duct taped her mouth closed. So this is a really interesting scenario, and we'll process it together. So let's read parts of the email. I wanted to ask you a question about a session that I had recently. I've been working with a 5-year-old child for about 2 months who has a significant trauma background, particularly neglect. He started a recent session as he usually does in the dollhouse, but about 30 minutes in, he found duct tape I have in my office, asked me to rip him off a piece, and proceeded to put the piece of tape over my mouth and sternly told me not to talk. Throughout the remainder of the session, he would remind me not to talk, but also still regularly interacted with me in non-aggressive ways and explored the office, but didn't do anything that required a limit. The duct tape stayed on my mouth until we left the playroom. I have a supervisor who is an RPTS but uses more directive theories, so when I told her about this session, she was adamant that I should have set more boundaries and not allowed the child to do this, but rather give him choices of putting tape on a puppet or a character instead. In the moment, I remembered you once saying limits are only needed when the child is unsafe, I'm unsafe, or something in the office is unsafe. And technically, I was never unsafe, which is why I didn't set a limit, but I later did question myself. I would love your perspective on this situation if you would have set a limit, and or your insight in general on how to set limits on power, control, and aggressive play when they are directed at you rather than at a toy or character. All right, so I liken this to the times when kids order us not to talk, or they shush us, or they tell us to shut up, or they say, if you say one more thing, I'm going to. That is essentially the exact same scenario. And in this case, there was just duct tape in the room, and therefore he used duct tape. Holly, as a general overarching thought, I'm really intrigued as to why there's duct tape in your room. So that's a very interesting playroom addition, I will say. But because there was access to duct tape, the insistence of not speaking changed a little bit. Because when a child says, stop talking, or stop copying me, or stop telling me how I feel, or you're not allowed to say another word, or shut up, you're so annoying. Or, I mean, look, we hear these things a lot, right? So in those scenarios, they are basically, quote, putting duct tape over our mouths, but it's proverbially. And in this case, he actually had duct tape with which he could, in fact, tape your mouth shut. So this is kind of an extra layer, but it's a very similar situation than from what we all go through. Okay, so let's process this a little bit. So your first question is, you questioned yourself later. Supervisor said you absolutely should have set a limit and could have given choices about putting tape on a puppet or a character. Okay, so I agree with you that did not warrant a limit, because the 3 considerations are you have to be safe, the child has to be safe, and the toys or the playroom cannot be damaged on purpose. All right, and none of those were being violated. Now, the other 3 questions that we ask are, can I consistently enforce this limit? Is this limit necessary? And if I allow this behavior to continue, can I still accept the child? And you obviously were able to still accept the child because you finished the session. No issues. The limit could consistently be enforced, but in your opinion, the limit was not necessary. So that kind of makes the second question moot. So in these specific 6 questions that we would filter through, you made the decision not to set a limit. I, in fact, would also agree. So I would not have set a limit either. I would have worked around the tape being on my mouth. So here's what I mean by that. I would not have taken the tape off. I would not have removed it, but I would have loosened it enough that I was able to speak here and there. And similarly to when a child tells us not to talk, forbids us to say another word, whatever the threat is. We slow the pace of our responses down. We respond more quietly, almost as if in a whisper, and we reflect and acknowledge that the child does not want us to talk, or the child is frustrated with us talking, or is uncomfortable with the things that we're saying, or whatever it is that we need to validate. We're going to lead with that, and then we're going to try to go back to the use of one of the skills. Now, if the child says, "I told you to stop talking," then we're going to say, "Oh, you still don't want me to speak." And then we're going to wait a little while, and then we're going to try again. Okay, so that's always the process for when a child tells us that we're forbidden to talk. I would have kept the tape on, but I would have made it loose enough that I could speak and would have seen how he responded to that. And if he would have said, "Your mouth is duct taped, you're not allowed to talk," I would say, "Oh, I'm not allowed to talk because I have duct tape on." And then I would wait a little while, and then I would try again, because often the power and control grabs like that are short-lived. So we can always kind of test and see how the child's going to receive us trying to engage verbally again. But here's the piece of this that I think is really important. When a child is ordering us not to speak, they need the why for us to speak. In other words, as soon as he says, "You're not allowed to talk," it's important for him to hear us say, "Oh, you don't want me to talk, but when I say what I see you doing, that's so you know that I'm paying attention." Or when I tell you what I think you were feeling, that's to make sure that I understood what was going on with you. Or, that would be reflecting feelings, right? The other one would be tracking behavior, then reflecting content. "Oh, when I say what you've said, it's to make sure that I heard you." So as long as we're giving the why behind the fact that we're talking, that usually makes the power and control grab not only a little bit less, but it also makes it a little bit quicker. And here's where I think the biggest piece of the puzzle here is. It was absolutely power and control. And we understand that the child is basically wanting dictatorial power and saying, "You're not allowed to do anything, including speak." That's about as authoritarian as you can be. And we understand the why there. He needs that feeling of complete control. Yet, as I've mentioned in earlier podcast episodes, we don't do our job if we are silent. Not only does the child feel watched, the child does not feel that we are engaged, and we're not able to say anything therapeutically valuable for a child. So it's very important that we continue to try to engage verbally. And look, if they tell us the whole time that we're not allowed to talk, we just continue to reflect that. I had a child that I think I've mentioned him in earlier episodes, but this was the one that said I was going to jail for, quote, 80, 100 years. And I wasn't going to get food, and I wasn't going to get drinks, and I wasn't even going to get out for Christmas. This kid was, it was power and control to the hilt. And every time I would talk, he would come over and he would write a big X on my notes that I was taking in session. He'd write a massive X on it, and then he would say, "If you say one more word, I'm taking this and you're never getting it back." And he would, in fact, because I would continue to speak. He would come over and he would rip my whole Padfolio out of my hand. He would shove it on a shelf, or he would shove it in a cubby, or he would hide it behind the puppet theater, and he wouldn't even let me take notes. And that was such a huge power and control dynamic for weeks and weeks and weeks. And sometimes I would even just get one word out. Like I would go, "You," and he would go, "I told you not to talk." And I would go, "Oh, I'm not allowed to talk yet." And he'd go, "Shut up." And I'm like, "Oh." And I was always acting like, "Oh, okay, I forgot I wasn't supposed to talk," right? So I'm still verbally engaging, but I was actually engaging about the fact that I wasn't allowed to talk more than I was doing anything therapeutically helpful, because he literally would not let me get anything out. And this went on for weeks. But I often thought about that, and I was like, if I would have just been silent, he gets no interaction, he gets no verbal engagement, he gets no therapeutic responses, and I would feel really guilty about charging a family for a session where I didn't engage in a therapeutically helpful manner. We have to interact with kids to do our jobs. So that means that we have to find workarounds in scenarios like this. And then to answer your final question, Holly, you said, what would we do, how to set limits on power, control, or aggressive play when they're directed at us? Okay, so we actually are going to consider the same 6 questions that we discussed earlier. Am I safe? Is the child safe? Is something getting broken or damaged? If it's no to all those, then it's, is this limit necessary? Can I consistently enforce this limit? Can I allow this behavior to continue and still accept this child? If we go through all 6 of those and it does not warrant a limit, then we just reflect content, we reflect feelings, and we track behavior. Now, should the aggression get to a level where we are no longer safe, or we cannot allow the behavior to continue and accept the child, then we would set a limit, just like we would set a limit on any other behavior. But depending on your personality, depending on your threshold for aggressive play, depending on your ability to withstand big power and control play, it will change whether or not you're actually setting limits in the playroom. I personally don't set limits on aggressive play hardly ever. And it's just because I'm comfortable with it and it doesn't really faze me. But I know a lot of therapists that really bothers them. And so it really is kind of a personal decision. But again, it's filtered through those 6 questions. And so even if they are being aggressive toward us, we determine, is it putting me in a position where I'm no longer safe? And or is this a necessary limit? And or can I allow this behavior to continue and still accept the child? If we go through all of that, that will tell us one way or the other whether we need to set the limit. Okay, and then this doesn't happen often, but Holly sent a subsequent email and gave us a little bit of an update. So now that I've answered the question, I want to actually share the rest of the update because it is an incredible ending to this. So I want to make sure that you all kind of get a little bit of follow-up here, which again, I don't typically get hey, this is what has happened since, but this is what happened this time. So I'm excited. All right. So she emailed back and said, I have some follow-up info regarding the question I originally asked. I've had a few more sessions with this client since then. And the next session, he immediately put tape again over my mouth. All right. So we see the repetitive nature of this. We see the need for power and control persist. About 10 minutes in, however, he hit his hand on the dollhouse and it opened a scab, so he was bleeding. When this happened, I took the tape off my mouth to help him clean it and get a Band-Aid, but then I put the tape back on. After this happened, it was like something shifted for him, and he immediately chose to take the tape off my mouth, and instead of our puppets being against each other and fighting as they were before, we were then on the same team fighting against a different puppet. In sessions since, he has not brought up taping my mouth or told me to stop talking, and he's continued to have our characters usually, not always, but most of the time, be on the same team, and our rapport has grown exponentially. Given this client's history of neglect and attachment trauma, it makes sense that the nurturing act of helping him while bleeding would mean a lot to him. I'm curious, had that not happened, how long it would have taken for him to want me to talk again. I listened to your podcast a few weeks back where you talked about don't talk to me moments and how we have to be talking to do our job well in the playroom, and this should be something to set a limit on. I completely understand what you're explaining in that podcast, but I'm torn because it seemed like allowing this client to put the tape over my mouth and then him deciding when to take it off was really therapeutic for him. Okay, so let me give a point of clarification, Holly. So it's not something we have to set a limit on when a child tells us not to talk. We can't set a limit on a request. We can give what we're willing or able to do in response, though. So you really don't want me to talk, but when I say what I see you doing, that's so that I'm making sure that I'm on track, or I'm making sure that I noticed what happened, or I'm letting you know that I was paying attention. That's actually not a limit. That's just setting an expectation of I'm acknowledging and validating you don't want me to, but here's why I'm doing it. And you don't necessarily stop according to the request, right? So we're not technically setting a limit. So I wanted to make that really clear. But let me share some thoughts on what you've described in this follow-up email. So look at how there was this massive shift. Now, all of a sudden, you and he have an allegiance. You and he have become allies. And we watch this happen in the playroom every single time with a child. They reach a point where they feel like we are on their team. It's us against whatever. And we're in this together. You're going to walk this journey with me. I can trust you. I have rapport built. We have relationship now. And our allegiance is going to be significant in our play. So it switched to collaborative. And that had been happening apparently because you said that you were fighting against each other as puppets. So he had already collaboratively included you. But now all of a sudden the shift is it's you and me against something else rather than you and me against each other. That will happen very consistently with every child. It's not always that overt, obviously, but we do see that shift. And then that's exactly what it is. It's a power dynamic shift. So he had all the power. He needed the power because he was fighting against you. So he was trying to make you less powerful because you were his enemy. You were the foe. And therefore, if you and he are going to be fighting, but you can't talk, he's giving himself the upper hand. He's putting you in a position of inferiority. But now all of a sudden, if you're on the same team, he's going to want you to be as strong and powerful as possible because you're in it to help him. So we can see the power shift that took place there. And I hear what you're saying. You were wondering how long that would have taken for him to want you to talk again had he not needed help with the Band-Aid. I cannot tell you the number of times random things have happened in play sessions that were not scripted, not planned. You can't anticipate them. They were complete surprises, but they have been so therapeutically meaningful in a very unexpected way. And I think that's one of the beautiful natures of child-centered play therapy, because sometimes crazy things happen and we watch how it becomes a therapeutically valuable moment. So I think that was what happened there. And we don't know, had that not happened, if he would have gotten to a place that quickly where he wanted you to talk. But because he needed a Band-Aid, that's how it unfolded. And that happens often. And then finally, you said allowing him to put the tape over your mouth and then he decided when to take it off was very therapeutic for him. I completely agree with you. So you would have allowed the tape to remain on and you would have been understanding and aware that he needs you to have tape on and he needs you to continue to be quiet. Yet you would continue to interact with him verbally through the tape. And then when he chose to take it off, it would be exactly the same scenario. So the tape would have still been on your mouth. It just would have been loose enough that you could still speak while the tape was covering your mouth. And then when he decided, for whatever reason, because of the Band-Aid or not, that he no longer had to have tape over your mouth, it would have been the same therapeutically valuable moment for him. So we wouldn't have set a limit on not having the tape, but we would have made it work and found a workaround so that we could still interact verbally. So Holly, first of all, thanks so much for the question, but then thanks so much for the follow-up, because it's so exciting when we get to hear some new information and how things continue to evolve with specific kids. All right, y'all, if you are interested in hanging out with me in October, I would love for you to attend the APT conference in Georgia. And every year they have their national conference, and this year it's in Atlanta. So get a plane ticket, get a train ticket, get in your car, however you need to get there. I'm thinking of country songs right now. But however you need to figure out how to get yourself to Atlanta in October, we're going to have a meetup, and Friday night is going to be so much fun. I'm working out details right now. I would love to get to see you and talk to you. I'm going to be recording podcast episodes live, so doing some interviews and some questions and answers and all kinds of things. It would mean so much to me to have as many of you as possible there. I know people are coming from Alaska. I know people are coming from all over the country. I might actually have 1 or 2 internationals coming. So it would be incredible to meet you. I would love to have you there. So please consider coming to the conference. I think that would be such an amazing thing. And then finally, if you would like to reach out to me, I would love to hear from you, Brenna at thekidcounselor.com. All right, y'all. I love you. Thanks for hanging out with me. Talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.